So having talked about why trade is economically efficient, it's useful to go through and talk about how the international community has worked to expand global trade over the last 50, 60, 70 years. The primary vehicle has been an international agreement, now called the World Trade Organization, but that initially began as the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. And the GATT, or the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, is one of the three Bretton Woods institutions or projects that was created at the end of World War II by the United States and its allies to really build a foundation for stabilizing the international economy. So the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, and then the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, which was a trade agreement to reduce trade barriers, to reduce tariffs, and to allow for states to have a way to cooperate and work through trade disputes and dispute resolution. And the idea was that the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade would be a starting point for additional work to bring down trade barriers and increase global trade between these member states. And the idea was that over the years, there would be these additional rounds of negotiations and trade talks in which they would target specific areas and say, okay, we're going to reduce trade barriers on manufactured goods or on electronics or agricultural products. And that would be the primary vehicle that would reduce trade barriers over the course of time. But there's been a second process that's also expanded the global trading system. That is that when the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade was established, there were about 40 member states, and today roughly 140 countries are full members of the World Trade Organization. The World Trade Organization was established after the Uruguay round. With these trade talks, they're oftentimes named after the place where they were initiated. And so in Uruguay in 1986, they started a new round of trade talks that rewrites the rules on global trade and creates this World Trade Organization, this institution that is the primary vehicle for the global trading system and really covers the vast majority of the Earth's countries and has really integrated the Earth into a global trading system with almost every country being a member, a handful of countries being observer states, and really only, Somalia, Eritrea, North Korea, and a few others that are not members of that system. Okay, so let's talk through some of the core ideas behind the World Trade Organization, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, and the principles that were sort of embedded at the start of this thing. There's three core ideas. One is this idea of national treatment, the idea that you will treat imported goods and domestic goods essentially the same, right? That they will have the same labeling requirements, that you're not going to have special rules and procedures for goods that are being brought in. If there's health and safety rules that you apply to your domestically manufactured goods, those same health and safety standards have to apply to foreign goods. You can't give them special requirements or special barriers. And so there's this idea that you don't differentiate in terms of policy between domestic and foreign goods. A second principle is the principle of reciprocity. This is sort of a political goal. While economists might tell you that it's economically efficient for everybody to just throw their trade barriers away, and it doesn't really matter what anybody else does, you're always better off having lower trade barriers. In practice, it's really difficult to do that. And part of this is that if you reduce trade barriers on, let's say, manufactured goods, that might mean that foreign goods coming in are going to outcompete domestically manufactured goods. And so when the United States signed on to NAFTA in the early 1990s, all of the TV manufacturers in the United States suddenly faced pressure coming from Mexico, where you could manufacture TVs for cheaper, and TV production in the United States essentially collapsed. And so TV manufacturers in Tennessee and Kentucky went broke or moved production to Mexico, and that's really politically damaging, right? That's a reason for people to be upset about trade. It disrupts people's lives, it disrupts jobs. And so if you're going to make that politically palatable, you need to be able to offer people something in return. And so you can say, yes, we're lowering our trade barriers on manufactured goods and televisions, and there's going to be job losses in that area, but Mexico and Canada are also lowering their trade barriers on all sorts of goods, including agricultural products, and this is a new market that U.S. farmers are going to be able to sell into, and so this is going to be a huge win for U.S. farmers. And so you can make the case that, yes, we're making concessions, but others are making concessions as well, and for every job that you point to as a lost job from trade, you can point to other jobs that were created because of new opportunities from trade. And so this is what makes the expansion of the global trading system, at least remotely palpable as a political process. And then the final piece is this idea of non-discrimination, which is kind of a weird term in terms of trading language. But essentially what it means is that once you're a member of the World Trade Organization, you're not going to be cutting special deals to any one random state. That if you give trade advantages to one state and have a lower trade like tariff rate, that you are going to give that lower tariff rate to all other states that are members of the World Trade Organization. And so in again, the history of trading language, this means that we're designating all members of the World Trade Organization as most favored nation. You're going to get the best deal that I offer out there. And if I cut a deal with one country, I'll extend that deal to everybody else automatically. And this is intended to create a situation in which there's really only one set of global trading rules. Now, that would be a great system from an economics perspective. That would be a great system in terms of efficiency. There are exceptions to that have emerged over the course of the 50 or 60 years that the GATT and World Trade Organization have been in place. And I'll sort of talk briefly about two different exceptions to that idea that everybody gets the same deal. One of those exceptions is this generalized system of preferences that was created in the 1970s. And so developing countries were looking at the World Trade Organization rules, and as they were joining the World Trade Organization were saying, sure, we want to participate in the system, but if we lower our trade barriers, we're going to be just smashed by foreign competition. We're never going to have a chance to develop our own industries. Could we possibly protect our own industries for a time, build them up, and then enter global competition full force in the future? And so there was a sort of hemming and hawing about how to manage that. And essentially what it boiled down to is that developing countries can cut special deals with developed countries, rich countries, about what that tariff rate looks like, and they can maybe have a higher tariff rate to protect domestic industries so that they have an opportunity to build up their economy. So that's one exception that's carved out. A second exception that's carved out that initially wasn't much of an issue is that under the World Trade Organization, states are allowed to establish regional trade agreements. And so the idea is that let's say the European Union, for example, that the European Union might be engaged in a project of economic integration, and they're bringing down all sorts of economic barriers. It wouldn't make sense that you would say to the European Union, you can't cut a cheaper deal with your neighbor as part of this project of economic integration in this region, because you have to extend that to everybody else in the entire world. And so there's this mechanism for states to form regional trade agreements, like NAFTA, where members of that regional agreement have lower trade barriers that they don't have to automatically extend to everybody else in the world all at once because of the most favored nation status that comes with World Trade Organization membership. So there are these regional organizations, but what we've ended up seeing happening over the years is that these regional organizations have really expanded, and there are dozens and dozens and dozens of these things. And so the global trading system has become something of a patchwork of different regional agreements that are creating lower trade barriers, as opposed to a single global trading system that was initially the goal of GATT and the World Trade Organization. So if I was going to offer a critique of the World Trade Organization, I think, and there certainly is grounds for critique, one of those that I would maybe flag is that the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade was really created by wealthy states. It was created by the United States and its allies as a club for wealthy nations to trade things that wealthy nations care about. And so there's a lot of attention in the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade and in the World Trade Organization on manufactured goods, particularly high-end manufactured goods. There's a lot of attention paid to patent law, copyright law, trademark law, intellectual property stuff. There's almost nothing that's been done in the area of agriculture. And wealthy countries have decided they want to preserve agriculture and protect agriculture from global competition that allows them to continue to subsidize agricultural production within their own country. And this has been something that poor countries have really pushed back against. They said, look, the vast majority of what we are producing is agricultural goods and commodities, but we're not able to sell into a global market because there are all these trade barriers that are in place. And so what we've ended up creating is a global trading system that's very competitive and provides access to markets for things that wealthy countries want to sell, and doesn't provide the same kind of access to markets for things that poor countries want to sell. A second problem has been that the decision-making of the World Trade Organization is really slanted in favor of wealthy states. And so typically in the 1970s and 80s and early 90s, the way that decisions would be made is that when states come together for a round of trade talks, wealthy countries would meet, they would talk about what they wanted to address, and they would come out and tell everybody else, okay, this is what we've decided is going to be the agenda, what we're going to work on. And so they've been able to sort of really shape the priorities of these organizations. And then the rules for the World Trade Organization for decision-making require unanimity. And while that might seem like a really high bar when you have 140 countries, that all have to be on the same page, the way that unanimity works is that these negotiations get broken up into thousands of separate meetings that tackle very minute aspects of the global trading system. And unanimity means that when the leader of the meeting says, are there any objections? If nobody raises their voice, there are no objections. And so what's ended up happening is that wealthy countries send to these meetings hundreds of diplomats to represent themselves in all of these different meetings. And poor countries are sending one or two diplomats who have to pick and choose which of these meetings to go through or go to, and as a result aren't there to say, no, I really object to the way that that rule is being written or to that policy. That asymmetry in terms of wealthy states having the diplomatic resources to really push their agenda and poor countries not has been something that we've seen poor countries push back against. And they haven't just pushed back against it in terms of complaining, they pushed back against it in terms of organization, and they began working together in a more unified way through the G77, the Group of 77, which is it's not actually 77 member countries, there's more than that, but it's a group of developing countries that they use the G77 to differentiate from the Group of 7, which are 7 industrialized democracies, as a way to differentiate that there's a lot more developing countries out there. And they've worked as a coherent bloc, and they've pushed forward an agenda and said, look, we need to have talks within the World Trade Organization, a round of trade focused on reducing agricultural barriers and addressing the concerns of poor states. And we're going to work and we're going to fight and make sure that this happens. And the result is that the last round of global trade talks was established in Doha in the very early 2000s, and it's 2018, and essentially that whole process has been stalemated, where wealthy countries have said we're not reducing barriers to trade on agricultural goods, and poor countries have said that's the whole point, we're pushing for this, you need to do this, and there's just been this stalemate in the global trading system. One last piece that I should talk about is how enforcement works within the World Trade Organization, right? There's rules in place that say you're supposed to have trade barriers at a certain level. What happens if states raise trade barriers and increase tariffs or subsidies in a way that distorts trade? Typically what will happen is that a country that feels that it's being the victim of unfair trade practices will go to the World Trade Organization and request a hearing, and World Trade Organization judges or adjudicators will listen, and they will say, yes, indeed, you were discriminated against by unfair trade practices. We estimate how much the economic damage that you're encountering is from that, and we are authorizing you to impose an equal level of economic damage through tariffs on the state that's engaged in unfair trade practices. And so the idea is that this is going to be a very transparent process, that it's going to be a process that is proportional. You were hurt this much, you can respond this much, and that by working through the World Trade Organization system and following this process, we're going to prevent trade wars from escalating into a shredding of the global trading system. But what ends up happening is that those tariffs that get put in place in retaliation, we're certainly seeing this in the United States right now, President Trump's efforts to protect specific industries. I think steel is a high priority of his. European, Canadian, Chinese governments have looked at this and said, we're going to respond and we're going to put tariffs on specific goods that we think are going to do real painful damage to the US economy, and specifically the US economy in a way that's going to hurt President Trump. And so states that were swing states or states that were very supportive of President Trump, like North Dakota, tend to be hit harder by these retaliatory tariffs, like tariffs placed on soybeans, as a way to inflict economic harm that will create political pressure to respond. We saw this in the early 2000s when President George W. Bush tried to do a similar thing with tariffs on steel. Europeans responded with tariffs on oranges, which actually made a lot of sense given that George Bush was president because of a razor-thin victory in Florida. Oranges are grown in Florida. If you can maybe create a political headache for him in Florida, that might be all for the good. Also, his brother Jeb was governor of Florida at the time, and so they were thinking that if you could affect Florida's economy, you could possibly put enough pressure on the president to reverse course. And so that's a lot of the idea of these sorts of retaliatory tariffs, is that the idea is to push back in a way that's going to get the initial tariffs to be abandoned so that we can go back to a world in which trade barriers are relatively low.